should we pay more? Should the clients pay more for good information practice? It's a general question. Does it cost more to have what you have told us about this morning?
I think it's essentially sort of shared. So everyone involved in the process is both benefiting and making stuff more efficient.
Should we do that anyway? Shouldn't that happen anyway?
On the technologies and training to get that sort of output. So in terms of the initial investment, I suppose it should be shared and the initial sort of starting those processes, but when it comes out to the end of it, we see it as essentially coming back to being level and getting a better quality product at the end of the day.
Very good. Sarah?
I just think on that, on whether the client needs to spend more money in getting that good information, I do think it's not more in them spending it or that idea at the start, but it's more them enforcing it. So in that, the documents that we mentioned previously of like your EIR and your AIR, it's more setting that ground from baseline and saying that this is what we want. I think that then kind of promotes the use of good information practice and manages it that way. So hopefully it won't cost.
I think both very interesting points there, and I think from good information practice, I mean, every organisation, the project has its outcomes for trying to achieve a certain amount of information or use information. Organisations working on the project also have a certain selfish need as well to improve their own business by using information as well. And I think through standardisation, whether that's through ISO 19650 or other type of standards, that eventually then is everybody's benefit when everybody's, each individual organisation is trying to achieve that as well. So I think it's for a greater good, but it needs to be obviously, done to make sure that it's been done for the better of the project and the better for the organisations involved as well.
Any questions from the audience for our speakers? We have a mic there. David.
Congratulations, everybody. It was very, very nice to get three different perspectives on a common theme. I think Liam touched on open BIM tools, and IFC would be the one that I would be more familiar with. You mentioned stuff in terms of issue tracking as well, which pricked my ears up. And I suppose in terms of, your role in design stage, Sarah's role in construction, and Jonathan's as maybe a consultant into it, what are your opinions on the uptake of open BIM tools, and is it something that you would actively write into execution plans at this stage?
It's definitely been slow, and people have been sort of slightly siloed within their own software for a little while. But there has been a lot more movement towards sort of open transfer of information. Like only recently, a month or so ago, we were chatting earlier, we had sort of a QS calling asking for an IFC for the first time in a good while, first time ever in my experience. So like bit by bit, everyone is coming along on the sort of the ISO standards and open BIM standards, and particularly with the projects with the glass roof canopy, like there would have been no way of the specialist subcontractor using their software, the structural engineer using Revit, and us using ArchiCAD, that process would have worked without open BIM. And particularly with other countries around the world with different mixes of softwares being used, there'll be an increasing need, from my opinion, for that sort of interoperability, and it seems to work really well for us. So I don't see why it shouldn't for everyone else.
I think on that as well, just with that kind of open BIM tools, I'm seeing a lot working with subcontractors that not all subcontractors have the capability to create a 3D model. And in that case, some of them might be more familiar with AutoCAD rather than Revit or SolidWorks or Tekna, and it's all the different ones. And I think in us kind of trying to implement that digital transformation in walls and introducing even a viewer, we introduced Dalux on a couple of our jobs just to kind of get that engagement. The idea of a subcontractor coming in and maybe using a tool that isn't Revit, that we would mainly have in our BIM execution plan, we'd have down that we'd use Revit and Navisworks just by default, I guess, because it's what we usually see. But the idea of a subcontractor using a 3D model and getting involved in that way is ideal. So I do think that IFCs are quite useful. And again, I'm seeing it more and more. We're trying to introduce some more tools for model checking and like that, even Costex as well. And it's IFC that has to be used, and then I don't know if it has to be, but we're seeing it being more that it is being used, and then so it is that case that having that IFC file works good for us. And whether it needs to be input into the BIM execution plan, I do think it's something that can come with that agreement, and when you have that kick-off meeting, finding out what your task teams are using and then providing them that.
Yeah, and I suppose for my context as well, I mean, I definitely see more of an uptake in IFC in the last number of years, but I do think Open BIM needs to get better. I mean, certainly what I see from an Autodesk perspective is, there's a lot more IFC support in the likes of Autodesk Construction Cloud, but I do think it's important to make sure that Open BIM is addressed by, whether it's the vendors or, to make sure it is, identified in the BIM execution plan as well. It's definitely something I think as an industry we need to get better at, because I mean, in 5-10 years time, with all this information that we have being generated at the moment for maintaining buildings, it needs to be in an open standard or neutral standard as well. So it's definitely something that we need to push for in the industry.
And actually, David, just for your information and everyone else's information here, Building Smart International have developed a professional foundation certificate in Open BIM, and it's developed across 17 chapters across the world in 14 languages. And the UKI chapter, I was involved with that group in developing the Irish questions for that foundation certificate. So it's just like doing a driving licence. You have to attend an approved training provider. And by the way, this is not rolled out in Ireland. I think UKI Building Smart are having a challenge getting training providers to deliver this course in Ireland. And it's just like doing a driving licence. You sit the test, you have to get 80%, and if you get 80%, you get your badge, your Open BIM badge from Building Smart. And if the QSs and the architects and the engineers and the contractors all do it, then we'll have that consistency that's needed. So Building Smart International Professional Foundation in Open BIM. I recommend that you all look at that. So any other questions? Yes.
I have a kind of general question that I'd like to ask, because I think we have a lot of experts in the room. We're using BIM, but we're actually examining our naming conventions, and we've come across an interesting one that we realise that there's a sort of we've been using NBS as we're using Rivet, and they use CAUSE and Uniclass, and we realise there's a kind of development going on with naming conventions. We're concerned NBS are not giving us any comfort that they're going to stay in the Irish market. So we're wondering about, we want to standardise our naming conventions across our various platforms, to make things more efficient. But actually figuring out which is the best one is actually quite difficult. Obviously we're not the experts, but I just thought I'd ask the question to the experts in the room. Thank you.
And you're representing an architectural practice?
We're an architectural practice.
Very good.
Quite an interesting one that I think my presentation I kind of focused on having that standard there and focusing that we should stick to the standard. And I do see what you're saying, that if there's kind of not a standard to follow for future protection nearly. And the only answer that I can think of, like if I was faced with this right now and I was in that position, it would all come down to the plan and what you're outlining and what you're confirming. And it has to be something that you would stick to as well. I do think if you look at, say, where we went from past 1192 to ISO 19650, there wasn't so much of a change. And the same with then introducing the Irish Annex. There's slight changes in site rearrangements. So I think more on the core of, say, the information types and the containers. So I can take pictures of them across the screen, I just can't think. I think on more standardising then, that they can be maybe interchangeable and moving would kind of future-proof that in a way, so that you have that there. But I do see that difficulty, and I would, if it was me right now, I'd focus on it for project basis and have that plan set in place, and it's just all about that communication there. So
Yeah, and then just to add to that, I mean, certainly what I see with a lot of Diatech customers as well, a client may come in and request a certain different type of standard, or you may be doing a project in a different region that has a different standard, but I suppose what I see used mostly and still used mostly is the UK Annex as part of ISO 19650, and a lot of Irish organisations are still sticking with that because they're working in both markets. What you don't want to happen is, that you've maybe got your Irish-based office or Irish-based projects are just using the Irish Annex, and UK-based, projects are using the UK Annex or a different type of standard, because that's just going to cause organisation and kind of complexity as well, and confusion. So I suppose it's about working to a standard that you use every day, but then obviously being flexible that if a client or a project has a different requirement, that you're able to adapt to that as well, rather than putting all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, I suppose us ourselves as well, so there's a similar sort of question that we've asked ourselves recently, and it's largely to do with the end user and what they need out of the project. So we have our own, the ISO sort of naming conventions for the drawings themselves is sort of fairly standard in terms of the individual building model elements, the naming for those. We had our previous naming standard that worked really well for us, but then with a certain client they wanted sort of the Kobe outputs and having that as their sort of final building model output. So we essentially have sort of, what's the word for it, hedged our bets, and we have the sort of the two in tandem. So we have basically, we're still using our own naming standard, but we've got an in-house document that translates those directly to the Kobe standards, and could potentially do that in future with any other standards that become sort of mainstream or the accepted standard.
Thank you.
So I just wonder, is it like every standard, they're making recommendations? Obviously, if the Irish Annex, some very clever people sat on that BIM committee and they decided this is the best for Ireland. So, but what you're saying is that in certain project contexts, you may not use that. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, and that's not so. It's not a problem derogating from the Annex framework. Yeah. Any other questions? Do you have any other questions? Okay, one question at the back there.
Hi there. I think it's more directed to the contractors and the architect. With regards to building information models, are you guys finding it that models are becoming part of the contract that is actually going to be becoming contractually applicable? Like if there's anything missing in a model that a person might use, that it can be contractually, you can be held liable that it's not in there, for example, quantity extraction, things like that? Or is it just a nice add-on tool used in projects where your 2D drawings are still more the actual, the go-to material when you're getting specifications or anything like that from?
For us, it is there's a BIM execution plan, and it is being provided as part of the contract, but it's not a contract document at the moment. There's been a few times where it's been intended as a contract document, and with some of the extra design input and time to get it to that level, the client sort of rolled back and just said we'd actually prefer just to have it as a useful bit of information that's not necessarily part of the contract. And we have actually found, like you said, nervousness with people sharing their models. So during construction on one of the buildings, one of the subcontractors was doing all their M&E in Revit MEP. They had all the building information and they could just send it across to us for us to check it for clashes and everything like that. But they were contractually nervous, saying, well, if we give you this and there's stuff wrong, what's the comeback on us? So we had a very slow and frustrating process of getting the 2D CADs over from them that were extracts and trying to get to the information that they had sitting readily available in their office that they weren't comfortable with sharing with us. So I think it's definitely still in a bit of a, from the projects that we work on anyway, in still a bit of a transitionary phase. And there's only sort of some of the bigger projects where there's a real BIM vision that's being driven by the client, and it's all part of the initial contracts that it's actually going through in the way that in future how we would expect it to sort of go.
This is actually quite an interesting one for myself with the experience that I've had. I do think when we receive our models, say, at tender stage, to move from tender stage into construction stage. And there is that kind of a little bit of question there and like kind of trust in it, like is everything in this, are the quantities correct and is it right? And I do think what we're seeing now, and a reason why I kind of love this whole BIM adaptation and BIM process, is we're seeing that this information does need to be improved. And like that, it is mentioned that the BIM model is not a contractual document, that if repeated again and again, it's not contractual. But what would be listed in the works requirements is that we fulfill a BIM level 2 or BIM stage 2 project in integrating the processes of BIM, which would mean that you couldn't be cutting your 2D drawings, which are contractual, from the 3D model, which would mean that that information would have to be correct. I have had experiences where the 2D drawings, while looking at them on that 2D plan, I couldn't tell why there was an extra line on the stairs or what it was, and it wasn't until I opened that model that I realised there was an extra stairs within the model. And of course, there was someone that is responsible for that if you revert back to your responsibility matrix. But it was more so that I saw that in the model, and it was that we needed that updated. So it wasn't that we were holding, say, we weren't going to say we were going to build 2 stairs. It's something that we addressed at when we came across it, and it was something to be corrected. But I do think the great thing of this, and even if it isn't contractual, the fact that your 2D drawings are contractual, I do think this whole process is improving the information. We're getting a better quality as a result, and in overall, it should be reducing the time of the project, the time of basically information management overall. So it's not something that you want to say use it. I think you mentioned to hold it against the who modelled that and who's responsible for that, but it's more just enhancing that as a collaborative approach. And just, I think that's where the understanding is. And coming from the main contractor, of course, we blame the design team, and I'm sure the design team blame us, and it's back and forth. But it's more so that we have to end up working together. The end result is that we do want that building to be built, and we do want the 3D model to maybe be an AIM at the end. So it is that case that it is that working together rather than targeting each other.
Okay. So just looking at the time on my right, and I want to try and finish on time. So I'd just like to wrap things up and show your appreciation for our 3 wonderful speakers this morning.